Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am AA Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Christopher Wyatt. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't you start us off with just telling me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am a self-described autistic self-advocate. So I am autistic with ADHD. I had previously had other diagnoses. And the reason I think that's important is because I'm also a father, which is my most important role in life. So I'm a father to two wonderful neurodiverse daughters. And I am a husband to an outstanding engineer whom I love very much. But the autism and the ADHD, among other things, certainly shape my relationships with my wife, my children, and colleagues. I think I am blessed in the sense that I went through the education system and through the higher education system as someone with physical and cognitive differences. So that also makes me a better informed advocate on behalf of my daughters. And probably the most frustrating thing that I've noticed is that even though I have gone through my PhD, my MFA, et cetera, the school system that my daughters are experiencing has not changed as much as I would have hoped. The problems that they encounter are almost identical to the problems I encountered. It's like, gosh, I keep reading and writing all these articles about how things are changing, and I'm looking at what my girls go through, and I'm like, oh, well, I guess we sort of stood still for the last 2 decades.
Yeah, that's interesting. So first question I usually ask is, what is your definition of inclusion?
Well, for me, it should be natural inclusion, which is that we design spaces and virtual technologies in a way that anyone can access and use them without special allowances. So, for example, I'm a big believer in things like ramps. Having gone to university in Minnesota, one of the things that the university has done very well because of the weather is they've put ramps and tunnels in for all of the classrooms. Whether I needed them because I used a cane and a pull cart, I'm partially paralyzed on the right side. Those ramps, they made my life easier, but they also made life easier for absolutely everyone. They were easier to clear of snow. They were safer in ice because they're pebble coated. The tunnels, again, great safety feature, but at the same time, it's making it inclusive for students with vision, auditory, mobility, and other issues. So a really good way of looking at inclusion to me is designing so everybody can use something and no one has to get special help. Nobody had to come and help me get to my classroom. Nobody had to come and help someone with vision impairment, because the tunnels and the ramps have braille signage, they have bumps for texture. So everything done was with the idea of inclusive design. And to me, that is a universal design. It's one that doesn't require changing things for the students or for the customers, the clients, or the employees. So that's what inclusion means to me, is it's nearly invisible.
I love that definition, and it seems so simple. So why aren't we there everywhere? Why is not everything designed that way?
I think the first reason, and it's the awful reality, is cost.
Right.
And I don't care if you look at Europe or the US or Australia, France, these questions come up even in other political systems. But the reality is let's take the UK, where they have nationalized healthcare and pretty strict government oversight of things. They say, well, this building was built 400 years ago. We don't want to modify it. Modifying a 400-year-old building is sacrilege.
Right.
So it immediately becomes off limits to those with mobility needs.
Yep.
So a lot of times these things are, well, this is the way we've always done it. We're not going to change. How dare you suggest we're doing it wrong? This is our tradition. So when I take a look at what France has done, France is very resistant to inclusion. And I've done podcasts and media interviews with the French advocates. And as we're looking at their system, again, they are very resistant to change. I mean, this is a country that rigidly says this is what French language is, and how dare you bring in other words. Well,
Right.
they take that to their buildings, they take that to their art museums. We're not going to make this accessible. How dare you demand it? So it's not a matter of just the cost, but there's a social cost that these individuals, they want to cling to the past and tradition. So we don't do it because it requires thinking ahead. It requires making change, and people don't like change.
Right.
And it also requires including the people with the disabilities. I don't think you can design a space for blind people without having a vision impaired person on your team. It's just, that's stupid.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that
So,
makes a lot of sense.
yeah, and it really bothers me when I go into a company and they say things like, well, we're going to improve our website for accessibility. And I say, great. Now, who are the people with mobility or vision differences or whatever? Now, who are the people with differences who are going to help you test your new website?
Right.
Well, we're going to use automated testing. Well, AI and automated scripts and whatever are not the same as having a diverse employment team that's going to test things. So a lot of times it's just they take the easy path. Again, hard work and is to include everyone and think of everything. And it's resisted in our schools. It's resisted in our employment. It's just difficult to get people to see the big picture of how opening up spaces includes more ideas, more people, makes it easier for everybody. But
yeah,
that's where we are as a species, not just as a country. It's a global issue.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about more your experience? Like you said, you mentioned how you are surprised, or I'm not sure the word you used, how it, you went through school, now your daughters are in school and it hasn't changed as much as you thought. Can you describe like your experience and like what they're experiencing and how it hasn't changed?
So here we are post-COVID. And post-COVID, what surprises me most of all is that they are still using technology in the worst possible ways. My daughters both have ADHD. Computers allow you to open 20 tabs at once and go down rabbit holes. It doesn't really work well if you need focus.
Right.
But the schools are like, well, we bought all these platforms, we have all this online learning, this is how we're going to do it. What hasn't changed is that the teachers and the administrators are busy using checklists from the federal government and state government, but they aren't listening to the parents and saying, oh, well, this child needs different accommodations. I also am surprised. The things that haven't changed are everything from the small things like the emphasis on group work, which I think we need to evolve on. We were really stuck in a group work mentality that there's a great book by Susan Cain called Quiet. Introverts are apparently broken. Extroverts are apparently not broken. They're the right way to be. And so we want kids to do group work. I struggled with group work as a student.
Right.
Now my daughters are struggling with group work as students.
Yeah.
I struggled with social skills. They're struggling with social skills. And so those things that are being prioritized by our education establishment don't always translate to what works best. Whether it's reading, writing, math. My littlest one is really struggling in math because they do all these funky models and physical manipulatives. But if you show her, here's how to do multiplication of fractions on paper, just going straight across without building models of it, she can fly through it. And those are problems I had too. I'm a very visual thinker in my mind, but I don't want to sit there and try to figure out building blocks.
Right.
They just confuse me and confound me. So a lot of it is strategies are used that have been shown to not work for neurodiverse students, and they don't always work for those students who are different physically or cognitively in other ways. But we are clinging to them because we have been told for 100 years they're the right way to do things.
Right.
Put the desks in nice straight rows, have them listen to the teacher. Let's take the test. Now let's go do some group work randomly.
Right. There's
no transition. It's just suddenly jumping things. So they do a very poor job of transitioning still, which, in the 80s, we talked about this, how you needed to do an into the lesson, through the lesson, now beyond the lesson, foreshadow what's coming tomorrow.
Yeah.
We knew all these theories, and yeah, that's nice, but the teachers we've got 40 minutes. We're going to fly through this.
Right.
So we haven't evolved. We know the sciences like phonics works for reading, graphemes work for reading and writing. Doesn't matter. We're going to do, hey, what does the picture show you about the words? What do you guess it means? Let's read the whole word. So even though we know certain things do work, we know but we just ignore it.
Right.
And again, it goes back to, well, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way my mentor teacher did it when I was a student teacher. So this is how I'm doing it as a teacher. Like, well, there's a whole lot of research on inclusion and diversity and learning styles. But, the mentor teacher who taught for 20 or 30 years taught the new teacher because that's part of the credentialing process. So they picked up the same old habits.
Yep.
And administrators have to come from teaching, so they're not great administrators because I've always found it interesting. We make it so a principal has to have been a classroom teacher. I understand the philosophy, but they're two different skill sets.
True.
I want the best money person, the best manager to be a principal, and I want the best teachers to be in the classroom with the kids.
Yeah.
So we have a broken system, and we haven't figured out how to evolve, again, because change is hard. Why would I change anything?
Right. So have your children only gone to school in Texas, or have they gone to school in different states?
They started in Pennsylvania, and then we moved to Texas. But the youngest, she started kindergarten here because it was her second go. We hit a lot of the same things. We're seeing whether it was Pennsylvania or Texas.
Okay.
Their big emphasis in Pennsylvania was the Keystone test, which was their state version of No Child Left Behind. Here in Texas, it's called the STAR.
Okay.
Let's take our STAR practice. Let's practice bubbling things. And I'm sitting there thinking, where's our higher level thinking? Where's our writing skills? But no, it's whether it was Pennsylvania or Texas, it's been the Keystone, the STAR.
Right.
That's where we are. And the sad thing is even the federal regulations, No Child Left Behind, do not require testing every year. It requires it incrementally. I think it was 4, 8, and 12. But for whatever reason, states have said, wow, we're going to test every year and we're going to do bubbling forever. And that's not how my children learn. No.
Yeah. So when you were in school, did you have like an IEP and stuff, or how was that?
No. So the only thing that I ever got pulled out for was the gifted and talented program.
Okay.
The evolution of the IEP and the 504, people don't realize, even though they were implemented in the 90s, it took a long time for these to really get enforced. There are a number of lawsuits that have occurred. In fact, I'm thinking of, there were a few in Minnesota where parents were saying, hey, our children aren't getting the supports they need. So it's really been in the last 20 years that the IEP meetings have become more routine and more regulated. The Office of Special Education Programs has done a much better job. But again, I always worry about that because unfortunately, if there isn't federal oversight, a lot of the districts and states just won't push special education. So I did not have those supports.
Okay.
In many ways, I think I was better off. And I say that because to me, inclusion means I'm in the classroom with my peers.
Right.
As were my daughters, and my oldest, she gets pulled out for learning idioms and learning speech. Then she gets pulled out for some behavioral supports and social supports. Then she gets pulled out for something else. Pulling a student out of the classroom, which I understand doing because of the IEP, to prove that you can document that they got 20 minutes 3 times a week of whatever, that's a wonderful ideal. But pulling them from the classroom constantly makes them stand out. It is the exact opposite of inclusion. It's a very problematic approach. So in that sense, while I appreciate that they do these supports, I wish that they were integrated into the classroom better.
Yeah. So the reason I got into the inclusion piece, so I have a daughter, she just turned 22 in October, so she aged out of the transition age of school, but I got into inclusion because she uses a wheelchair, has cerebral palsy, epilepsies, and I didn't know anything about special education, so we just went along with the school, which meant she got sent to a segregated classroom across town when her brother could walk just to the neighborhood school. Went to see her at lunchtime, and the kids in her room with her were folding towels already. And I'm like, these kids are kindergarten, first, second grade. Why are we already folding towels? Found out about inclusion. So that was kind of how we went down that path. I also have a son who's 15 months older who was in the gifted and talented. And what you're talking about for him was, to get, the services for him, he would have to leave the classroom. Well, he didn't like that because, like you're saying, now you're different. You're leaving the classroom, coming back. He didn't like the attention. So, yeah, I agree with you that the inclusion, they should be in the room. But for my daughter, once she was already on that path in that segregated classroom, trying to get her back into the gen ed setting was hard and a struggle the whole time, because now there was these extra hoops she had to jump through to get back in there that weren't there like if you started out in the gen ed. So it was just this whole weird thing about inclusion, which I didn't know existed, and I don't think's right. So trying to bring awareness to that and help other families, in that similar situation.
It surprises me because teaching at the University of Minnesota as a graduate assistant, I had students who had wheelchairs, motorized wheelchairs, one that used breath control to move the wheelchair.
Sure.
I've worked with students who had cerebral palsy, quadriplegia from an accident, and the universities have done a really good job of ensuring things work. When I was in Pennsylvania, there were 2 instances at the university where I was teaching where a ramp was crumbling. The concrete had gone bad because of years of ice and salt and whatever they used. And that ramp was very quickly fixed because the dean I worked under said, this will get fixed.
Right. Yep.
And there was another moment, because I was using a cane, it was winter, I tried to use the elevator. The elevator doors opened to reveal all of the janitorial supplies. How do you even understand that other than, well, nobody had raised the need for an elevator?
Right.
Now, I understand this was a small university and there weren't a lot of people with differences. But again, I brought it up to the dean, and he made sure that the very next day that the janitorial supplies were, in the janitorial closet where they belong.
For sure.
So again, it was leadership that was really forward thinking. It was leadership that understood students. I would say, I don't know whether the dean was a great teacher. He was a great administrator, because what he did was he went out of his way to make sure students and faculty had the tools they needed. That's why I say a principal is different than a teacher. I want a principal whose only goal is to make sure the students and teachers have what they need. And that person may not have been a classroom teacher. I want the teachers to have everything they need to get the students in through the door, the desks that accommodate wheelchairs, the lighting that can be adjusted, extra, headphones if necessary for students who need to block sound. That's what the teachers need, and they need administrators who understand those needs and will back them up when the teachers and parents ask for those things.
Right. Yeah, you're talking about the leadership, and their perspective makes a huge difference. That's what we experienced also. Is my view of inclusion was, full inclusion. I want her in the gen ed, and their definition is, well, she can go to lunch with her peers. So we had this massively different definition. And if, as a parent, when you're trying to, with my definition, trying to get her to be to that level, it's just a struggle. So it's just, and then that's their view of it. So that's what they're, telling all their staff below them. And it's just this struggle. So I'm glad to hear that you had some situations where the administration was more open to, being more inclusive, because that makes a huge difference.
One of the things I do like about my oldest daughter, her school, she goes to, in Texas, we have charter schools. So she goes to a charter school. And the nice thing about the school is the 7th grade is all together. The 6th grade is all together. They work in what are called pods.
Sure.
And so even those with differences are in the classroom. They're in together at all times. They have not only lunch together, but they take roughly the same courses. And even though she's in some of the honors classes, they do a very good job of aligning the honor schedule with the regular schedule. So the kids are interspersed.
That's
you
great.
Might have a section of really advanced math the pre-algebra class and another math class. But then she's going to run into her peers in her reading class or her art class or whatever other classes she has, plus PE. And they also didn't put her in adaptive PE, which I really appreciate. She has a back brace, but she's in PE with her peers.
Yep.
They provide the extra time to remove the brace, to put the brace back on. She does aquatics because that's better for someone with a bad back because of the water. So she does the aquatics PE with everyone else. And another girl, I believe she said, also has a brace for scoliosis.
Yep.
So when a school really includes, the students don't think about it. My daughter would not think about someone with special challenges or special support needs not being in her classroom.
Right.
That to her would seem unusual.
Right.
But they run into, like I said, we still run into some of the same issues. The reason we're not in the public school is, quite honestly, the public school was it was living in the past. They have not made the gains they need to make, and so we opted for the private charter. That is a very difficult choice, and it is one that not every parent can make.
Yep.
You don't get public busing, you don't get public funding to the same extent. There are a lot of challenges with making that, but with two special, two daughters who have differences and they need those special supports. We just couldn't get what we needed in the public schools. And to me, that's a shame, because you want parents to all be supportive of your public school. You want your public school you want your neighborhood school to be your neighborhood.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and then like if you need to, have your daughters go to that school to get their needs met because they're not being met in the public school, what about all those other kids that aren't able to do that? Now they're kind of stuck there, not getting their needs met. So it's kind of that struggle too.
Well, and probably the worst thing about it to me is the reason they weren't getting the needs met in the public school. They give you all the same answers, right? Well, we don't have an assessment available until 6 months from now. And until they're assessed, we're not going to do the IEP. Or in Texas, we call it an ARD.
Okay.
We're not going to have we don't have a school psychologist, so we can't do some of the behavioral intervention. Our teachers haven't received their special training because of COVID, and we're kind of short-staffed, so we're hiring on emergency credential.
Right.
And this is happening nationally. And as I said, teachers learn from the people they mentor with, and the mentors aren't all cutting edge. As someone who teaches at the university level, it's frustrating because the universities know what works, but K-12 is so separated from the universities. The best practices aren't adopted.
Okay.
I think here's a good example, right? I taught in Pennsylvania. My daughters started school in Pennsylvania. Carnegie Mellon, which is a wonderful university.
Yep.
Most of my students were from outside the United States. You take a look at a University of California, like UCLA, Berkeley, a lot of the students are transfer students from international campuses, from other states. We are doing a lousy job because we have the best universities in the world and some of the most mediocre K-12.
Right.
This disconnect, what it then does is it creates an environment in which the parents with resources get their kids the Kumon, Mathnasium, what are some of the others, these prep programs, the Princeton Review, the SAT, Kaplan SAT. So those parents get all these extra supports. Parents like, my wife and I, we have the kids enrolled in the YMCA. They go for the physical therapy. They go for swim, whether it was basketball, where it was not a true league. So my daughter could participate, even though she's not quite like her peers, the youngest. But parents with resources get an edge. And then because we pull out of the standard K-12 or we fight the standard K-12, we're not as supportive of it. We're not listened to. And so we get this bifurcated system where the parents who are really aggressive about getting the support needs or helping their students, we tend to be college educated. We tend to be upper middle class, and we fight for our children. But what about all those children from marginalized communities surrounding their local schools who are getting nothing? the funding gets cut. They can't pass a bond issue because there's no property to tax in some of these communities. It breaks my heart, and I feel horrible. I have said that one of the things I feel guilty about is sending my kids to charter schools because I want to support the local schools.
Yep.
I want to support the local teacher. But when we went in for the IEPs in our local schools, it was like, well, here's what we're going to do. And I'd say, excuse me, but our child also needs these things and needs to be with her peers. And they would say things like, well, I have a degree in blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, I know you're the principal and you have an ED doctorate or whatever, great, whatever. Yeah. But I know my child. I know my child's needs. And it's really sad that some of us, after doing this for years as advocates, we do reach the point of saying, look, I know this law. I have read IDEA. I have, here's what it says on the ed.gov website. Here's what my child is entitled to as part of I'm trying to think of the free and appropriate education has to be inclusive. That's part of it. It has to be appropriate. And segregating isn't appropriate. That's not preparing them to be citizens. And so the K-12, it's heartbreaking that they are locked in these ways of thinking, and I don't know how to change it. And the sad thing is there are great teachers, and I know many of them, but I also know a lot of great teachers who have left the system.
Yeah, for sure. How can educators embrace neurodiversity?
I think let's start by listening to the parents and listening to the students. If the student says, I really am distracted, I need to bring in my headphones, don't make a big deal about it. Say, bring in your headphones. Don't say, well, we need to look at the IEP or the 504 and let's see what's on the checklist. Oh, well, the headphones aren't on your checklist.
Right.
I hate death by checklists. I understand we have the checklist to make sure you're in legal compliance. Legal compliance is not inclusivity. Let's be blunt. Legally complying, doing the bare minimum to make the Department of Education or whoever happy is not inclusion. Inclusion is, what does the child need to succeed? That's it. That's inclusion. What does the child need to succeed? It is not, oh, well, this student's getting extra time and that's not fair. And no. What does that student need to succeed? Period. To me, that's inclusion, is when the teachers and the administrators are willing to listen and say, your child needs headphones. That's not on our IEP list, but let's get them the headphones. Or your child needs to sit back in the corner while taking a test because other people moving are too distracting. Then let's let your child have preferential seating during a test.
Right.
If your child really needs that daylight instead of fluorescent lights, let's put your child by the window so they're getting more natural light. It's not that hard to listen and say, okay, we can do that. Because generally we're not asking for $1 million solutions. Headphones are $5. I can get some noise canceling ones for $25. These are not going to break the bank. Now, issues like you won't put in a ramp, you won't let, the elevator is cluttered with janitorial supplies. Those are bigger issues. But most of us, when we want inclusion, we just want to be heard. And we just don't want our children to be part of the classroom.
Yes.
Now, as I said, my daughters really do struggle with group work. Group work ends in conflict for them because they get picked on, bullied, because they're different. They speak a little differently. They're, maybe their maturity is in some ways isn't the same, or maybe just their maturity is fine, but they don't care about the same things socially. Right. My oldest is happy in jeans and a t-shirt. Meanwhile, her friends are doing their makeup, braiding their hair, and talking about dating. And she's fine in jeans, t-shirt, and doing her work. She does not want to sit in a group and hear about lipstick. So she gets angry. She's like, hey, the group's not doing the work. It doesn't take extra for the teacher to say, okay, if you don't want to work in a group, here's an alternative assignment.
Exactly.
Why do we have to grade everybody on the group work? And they'll say, well, in the future, you're going to work in groups.
Not necessarily.
My wife has been in the same company for 18 years. They're in Minnesota. We're in Texas. She's working in her office. She's an engineer. Does she work with other people? Yes. Working with and collaborating can be done asynchronously. She does her part, sends it to the next person.
Yep.
They might send it back a few questions, but off it goes. It is not this classroom model of a bunch of people sitting around a table. That has never been my experience as a writer. As a writer, I write my column, I send it to the editor. Sometimes the editor sends me a question, but more often than not, it's just gone, and I never, hopefully it gets published and I get paid, right?
Yeah.
This idea that they do in the classroom is not real. It's not authentic group work. So again, listen to the parent. If the parent says my child doesn't do well in groups, it is not that difficult to come up with an alternative assignment.
Right.
So I don't understand this resistance to listening to parents, listening to the students, and just doing what we ask. Now, there are times where what some parents ask for is absolutely insane. I will admit that as a university instructor. Mm-hmm. I've had parents say, well, why can't my child have an open book test? When we have dual enrollment students, dual enrollment is where the child is still covered by K-12 law because they're 16 or 17 and taking a university class. But I'm sorry, an open book class test for your student is not the same. It's not equitable. Extra time, I'm okay with. A quiet testing place, I'm okay with. But your student getting to use notes and the others not, now that to me, so yeah, there are times where the requests are like, no, we can't do that.
Yes, for sure.
But for the most part, if that parent comes to me and says, look, my 16-year-old who's gifted is also autistic or has sensory processing issues or is dyslexic, extra time, no problem. But if you're asking me, can my child use the textbook for the test while the others don't? No, that's not. In an emergency, the doctor doesn't get the textbook.
That's very true. Yeah, that's great. What is one tip you can share to help our listeners be more inclusive today? Just something simple they can do starting today to be more inclusive.
Always listen. Always. Even my daughters and my wife and I think we know everything, and we get into that mindset of we're your parents. We can be wrong. It is very important for me to listen to my daughters and say, okay, Ann Lee, what do you need to do well in this course you're taking? You're struggling in math. What can I do to help you? It's not right, even as a parent, for me to say, I know what's best for you, because sometimes I don't know how their brains work. My neurodiversity isn't their neurodiversity, isn't my wife's differences as an engineer. I'm convinced all engineers are neurodiverse at some level. Listen to your spouse, listen to your partner, listen to your friends, your clients, your students. And listening is not just passively hearing. It is actively following up with what you heard.
Right.
It's not enough to say, I heard you. Great. If you're not going to actually make the change or make the adjustment or negotiate a compromise, all of those require action. So that's the big thing. Inclusion starts with listening.
Yeah, I love that. Where can everybody connect with you?
They can go to Linktree. It's a little confusing. It's linktr.ee/CS Wyatt. So Christopher Scott Wyatt, just CS Wyatt, and it has all the links to the Autistic Me podcast, the blog, our social media feeds, and everything else right there on Linktree. Just CS Wyatt.
Sounds good. I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. Ready for the last question?
Absolutely.
Do you like Spam? Yes or no?
Fried, and I like it with pineapple. Fried with pineapple.
Fried with pineapple? Yeah. Well, we talked before we started recording. I live in Austin, Minnesota, where they make Spam and where the Spam Museum's at. So I've been asking all my guests if they like it or not. It's actually quite even. I mean, it's right in the middle, around 50% either way. So
I have to say that my grandmother, one of the things she would do is she would slice Spam and fry it for my grandfather, and then just put it on some bread with ketchup, and that's what he would eat for lunch. And I never understood it, but when you're on a budget, that was that. And the other thing that they would eat that I never understood was Brunschwager.
Brown sugar? Yeah.
Liver. I never understood ground liver. But, when you're on a budget, everything tastes good.
Yeah, I mean, I remember growing up, my dad would eat brown sugar once in a while. I don't ever recall trying it. I have no desire to try it. No way.
spam was apparently it was a go-to. You could keep it canned, it could survive. You could eat it in any, no matter what. So yeah, spam grew up eating it, and the reason I say pineapple, I've had friends from
Hawaii.
in college, had a friend in Hawaii,
Yep.
and apparently spam is a thing.
Spam is supposedly apparently huge in Hawaii, I guess. Yeah, they from the war they had a lot of spam there, and yeah.
Spam and pineapple, pork and pineapple. Other people say no, but it works.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.